My mama's not okay.
Oh, sweetie, what's wrong?
A 6-year-old girl in a blue dress makes a decision no adult in her life would have sanctioned and boards a city bus alone to a wedding she was never invited to because her mama was crying and someone had to do something. What she sets in motion when she walks through those ballroom doors cannot be undone, and the man standing at the altar will never be the same. In a moment that stops a wedding and quietly rewrites 3 lives, Aaliyah Williams finds herself on the bathroom floor, a woman who holds everything together for everyone else, finally falling apart alone. She never expected her 6-year-old to notice. She never expected Petra to act. But Petra, armed with a granola bar, a bus route she had memorized from riding it with her mama, and a certainty that adults complicate things that don't have to be complicated, walks into a grand hotel ballroom in the middle of a ceremony and says the truest thing in the room. What Woobin does next, in front of 200 guests, a bride in white, and a child who is watching him with the most honest eyes he has ever seen, reveals exactly who he is beneath the tuxedo and the title. What begins as an interruption becomes a reckoning. What should have been a clean ending becomes, now slowly and with great difficulty, a real beginning. Aaliyah didn't send Petra. She didn't ask to be found. But love, it turns out, doesn't always arrive the way you planned. Sometimes it arrives in a blue dress, on the number 7 bus, with 2 granola bars and absolutely no patience for grown-up excuses. The mirror gave Woobin everything he was supposed to want. A perfect fit, a perfect morning. Jun Seo moved around him with practiced efficiency, each straightening the bow tie by a fraction of a degree, smoothing a lapel that didn't need smoothing, doing the small, careful things assistants do when they sense their employer has gone somewhere unreachable inside his own head. "You look excellent, sir," she said. Woobin said nothing. He looked at the man in the mirror, composed, correct, ready, and felt the particular hollowness of someone who has made a sensible decision and cannot stop paying for it. 3 miles away, Aaliyah Williams was on the bathroom floor. She had not planned to be there. She had made it as far as the edge of the tub before her legs simply declined to continue. And so she sat in yesterday's clothes with her back against the cold porcelain and let herself cry in the way she only ever allowed when she believed Petra was asleep. Quietly, carefully, with one hand pressed flat against her sternum, as though she could hold the feeling in place and keep it from spreading. She had been doing this for 3 mornings now. Woobin had not been her boyfriend. She had never used that word, had never let herself get close enough to the word to need it. What he had been was harder to name and easier to lose. The person who asked her questions and then actually waited for the answers. The person whose attention felt like being stood in a patch of sunlight after a very long winter. For a few months she had felt, without quite letting herself say so, like the full version of herself. Then he had said, with great gentleness and a face full of something that was probably genuine regret, that this wasn't something he could continue, that his family, that his obligations, that he was sorry. She had thanked him. She had meant it. And then she had come home and begun the slow work of putting herself back into the shape she'd been before, which was taking considerably longer than she'd expected. She didn't hear Petra come to the doorway. She only knew she was there when she looked up and found her daughter watching her. Not with alarm, but with the still, measuring calm of a child who has been quietly cataloging something for several days and has finally reached a conclusion. Petra studied her mother for a long moment. Then she turned and walked back down the hallway without a word. Aaliyah exhaled. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. She told herself today would be better. In the kitchen, Petra climbed onto the chair by the counter and picked up the stiff, cream envelope she had noticed 3 days ago and had been thinking about ever since. She turned it over. Read the address. Looked at the date. Today. She set it down carefully and went to find her blue dress. The blue dress was not her first choice. Her first choice was orange. A bright, decisive orange that Petra considered the only color worth wearing if you were going somewhere important. But the orange dress was in the laundry basket and the blue one was clean and hanging on the back of the door. And Petra was 6, but she was not unreasonable. She put on the blue dress. She made sure the buttons were straight. She found her backpack behind the bedroom door and unzipped it on the bed. Inside, her library card, a small notebook, a pencil with a unicorn eraser that she had decided was too good to actually use. She took out the notebook and opened it to a clean page and wrote, when in the large, careful letters she had been practicing since September, "Gone to fix it. Back soon." She read it over. It seemed accurate. She left it on the kitchen counter where Aaliyah would see it. Then she opened the cupboard and took 2 granola bars, one for the bus and one for later because her mother had always told her that you didn't go anywhere without a snack, and your mother's advice was still good advice, even when your mother was sitting on the bathroom floor. She put the invitation in her backpack. She knew the bus. She had ridden it with Aaliyah more times than she could count. To the grocery store, to her checkups at the clinic on Faro Street, to the library on the mornings when Aaliyah had the early shift and needed to drop her somewhere safe. She knew which stop they used. She knew to sit near the front. She knew to hold on when it turned. She locked the apartment door behind her with the spare key from the kitchen drawer and walked to the stop at the end of the block and stood with her backpack on both shoulders, watching for the right number. The bus came. She got on. She sat in the second row behind the driver and put her backpack on her lap and watched the city move past the window. It was not frightening. Petra had decided somewhere between finding the invitation and putting on her shoes, gosh, that there was no room for frightening right now. Her mom had been on that floor for 3 mornings. The man whose name was on the envelope was getting married today, which meant if she didn't go today, there wouldn't be another chance. And that seemed like exactly the kind of thing adults let happen because they were too busy being scared to be practical. Petra was not going to be that kind of person. She ate her first granola bar somewhere between the park and the overpass. She folded the wrapper neatly and put it in the front pocket of her backpack. Outside the window, the city kept going. Inside the bus, a 6-year-old in a blue dress held her backpack with both hands and rode towards something she had not yet decided to call brave. The ceremony had been running like a clock. Woobin had said the right things at the right moments, had turned when he was meant to turn, had looked at the woman beside him with an expression he hoped read as present. The officiant had a warm, unhurried voice and the kind of practiced authority that made everything feel inevitable. The room was full and still and smelled of white peonies. Everything was exactly as it had been arranged. He was in the middle of a breath when the doors opened. The sound was small, a soft, weighted thud from the back of the room, but it moved through the ceremony the way a stone moves through water, in rings. Heads turned. The officiant's cadence hitched almost imperceptibly. To somewhere in the third row, someone whispered and then stopped. Woobin looked up. A small girl in a blue dress was walking down the aisle. She was not hurrying. She was not looking at the flowers or the candles or the 200 people who had turned to watch her. She was looking directly at him with the fixed, undeflectable attention of someone who had come to do one thing and intended to do it. Her hair was in 2 puffs. She had a backpack on. She walked the full length of the aisle without slowing, and the room let her because there was something in her bearing that made interrupting her feel impossible. She stopped in front of the altar. In the second row, Junseo lowered the order of service slowly, the way you lower something when your hands have forgotten what they're holding. Beside him, Woobin felt his bride's grip shift on her bouquet. Not a flinch, just a loosening, in the involuntary adjustment of someone who has sensed that the ground has changed. The girl looked up at him. The room was so quiet he could hear the candles. "My mama is crying," she said. Her voice was clear and unhurried and entirely without performance. "So I came instead." Woobin did not speak. He was not capable of speaking. Something had happened to the inside of his chest. A shift, a giving way, when like a door that had been held shut for a long time, finally losing the argument with its own hinges. The words landed in him and kept going, past every careful, reasonable, well-constructed thing he had told himself over the past several weeks, down to something much older and quieter that had apparently been waiting. The officiant did not move. Nobody moved. Woobin looked at the child in the blue dress who had walked into his wedding with a backpack and said the truest thing in the room. And then he did the only thing that made any sense to him. He bent down, slowly, until he was at her level, until he could see her face properly, until there was nothing between them but a few inches of air, and everything he had been pretending wasn't true. Where is she? He asked quietly. Petra waited. She had the patience of someone who had learned early that adults needed a moment to catch up. And so she stood with her backpack straps in both hands and watched Wu Bin's face while he worked through whatever he was working through. She did not fidget. She did not look at the crowd. She had said what she came to say, and now it was his turn. The room was still holding its breath. Wu Bin stayed crouched at her level for another second. Then he stood. He straightened to his full height and turned to the woman beside him, his bride who had not moved, whose face had gone very still in the careful way of someone who already knows what is coming and is deciding how to hold it. He stepped toward her slightly, and what passed between them was quiet enough that the room could not hear a single word. But they could read her face, and they watched something move across it. Not shock, not anger, something more complicated and more dignified than either. Her chin lifted by a fraction. She gave a single small nod, the kind that costs something. The hand holding the bouquet released its tension all at once, and the flowers dropped an inch, and that was the only outward sign. Wu Bin said one more thing. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked away, toward the stained glass window on the far wall, and he understood that she was done with the conversation, and that this was her way of granting him permission to go, which was a kindness he did not deserve and would not forget. He stepped back from the altar. The murmur that moved through the room was low and immediate, the sound of 200 people recalibrating. Jun Seo was already at the door by the time he reached it. She had not been asked to be there. She had simply understood that this was where she needed to be, which was what made her indispensable. She held the door without comment, and he walked through it, and the heavy wood swung shut behind them and cut off the noise of the room entirely. The hotel steps were warm in the afternoon light. Petra was sitting on the curb with her second granola bar, her backpack beside her, watching a pigeon investigate the base of a lamppost with scientific interest. She heard him come out and looked up without surprise, as though she had calculated exactly how long he would need and had planned her snack accordingly. He stood at the top of the steps and looked at her. "She's at home," Petra said. She took a small, unhurried bite. "So you know where it is?" He did. He had stood outside the door of that building once, 3 weeks ago, and talked himself back into the elevator without knocking. He had called it the responsible choice all the way home. He looked at Petra. "Come on," he said. "Let's go." His car was too clean and too quiet for a 6-year-old. And Petra observed this without comment as she climbed into the back seat and buckled herself in with the focused competence of a child who had been doing it alone for some time. They pulled out of the hotel lot. The city opened up around them, ordinary and unhurried in the way cities are when you are the only one having the strangest afternoon of your life. "Do you like orange?" Petra asked. Wu Bin glanced in the rearview mirror. "As a color, yes." He considered it honestly. I've never thought about it much." Petra received this information with a small nod, as though it explained something she had already suspected. She looked out the window for a moment, then returned to him. "What does a CEO actually do?" "I run a company, make decisions, manage people." "What kind of decisions?" "Big ones, mostly. About where the company goes, what it does next." She was quiet for a few seconds. Then, "You're not very good at that." He didn't answer. She wasn't wrong. When they passed the park at the end of her street, and Wu Bin felt the distance closing in his chest the way it had been closing since he'd stood up from that crouch in front of the altar. The slow, irreversible shrinking of the space between the choice he'd made and the one he should have. "Why were you marrying the other lady?" Petra asked with the careful neutrality of someone asking a genuinely factual question. "If you liked my mama better?" The light ahead turned red. He stopped. He looked in the mirror at the small face watching him with complete seriousness, the granola bar wrapper folded into a tidy square in her lap, and he thought about all the sophisticated answers he could give. The family, the expectations, the calculus of what was practical and what was possible, and discarded every one of them. "Because I was afraid," he said. Petra looked at him for a moment, then she turned back to the window. "Okay," she said simply, as though this was not a particularly impressive answer, but was at least an honest one, and honesty was the minimum requirement. He parked on the street outside Aaliyah's building and told Petra to wait, that he would come back for her, that she had his word. She nodded and took out her library card and began examining it as though this was a reasonable way to spend the next few minutes, which for Petra it apparently was. He took the elevator alone. He knocked. There was a long pause, long enough that he almost lost his nerve, almost turned back toward the elevator, almost called it something reasonable again. Then he heard footsteps and the door opened. Aaliyah stood in yesterday's clothes with reddened eyes and no prepared expression whatsoever. She stared at him, then past him, then back. "Where is Petra?" "Downstairs," he said. "Safe. She came to get me." The door stayed open. She did not invite him in so much as she simply left the door open and walked back into the apartment, which he understood was the same thing under the circumstances. The living room was tidy in the deliberate way of someone who maintains order as a form of control over things that cannot otherwise be controlled. He stood near the door. She stood near the window. Neither of them moved toward the other, and in the distance between them felt accurate, not hostile, but honest. "She took the bus," Aaliyah said. It was not quite a question. "Yes." She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she looked tired in a way that went deeper than sleep. "I didn't send her." "I know. I need you to know that." "I do," he said. "I know." She looked at him then, really looked, the way she had always looked at things, with the full weight of her attention, which was one of the things about her he had been trying not to think about for 3 weeks. She was not grateful. She was not relieved. She was something more difficult and more valuable than either. She was precise. "I want to tell you what it cost," she said, "not to punish you, just because if this conversation is going to be worth having, you need to know." "Okay," she told him. She did not raise her voice. She did not reach for the kind of language that performs pain for an audience. She simply said in the same quiet register she used for everything that mattered to her, what the previous 3 weeks had actually been. The mornings that arrived already exhausted, the work she had carried through anyway, the specific loneliness of losing something that was never officially there to begin with, and therefore came with no language for grieving it. He listened. He did not apologize in the middle of it, which she would have hated. He waited until she was finished and the room had settled back into stillness. "What changed?" she asked. "Today." "What changed?" "Nothing," he said. She was quiet. "I had always known," he said. "I told myself it was manageable, that it was the responsible thing to let it be manageable. I was wrong about that." "You left a wedding," she said. "Yes. That's not a small thing to come back from." "I know that too." She looked at him for a long time. He did not try to fill the silence, which was the right instinct, and she noticed it. Outside, somewhere below them, Petra was sitting in a very expensive car with her library card, waiting with the patience of someone who had already done the hard part and was content to let the adults handle the rest. Aaliyah exhaled slowly. She looked at the window, then back at him. "Sit down," she said finally. It was not forgiveness. It was not a beginning exactly. It was something smaller and more durable than either. The door left open, and the first tentative decision not to close it. He sat down. Petra came back upstairs 20 minutes after Wubin had texted June Seo the building address, and she walked through the front door with the air of someone returning from a task they had completed satisfactorily. She looked at Wubin sitting at the kitchen table. She looked at Aaliyah standing by the counter. She assessed the situation and apparently found it acceptable. "We should get dinner," she announced. It was not a question, and nobody treated it as one. Aaliyah ordered from the Thai place 2 blocks over, Petra's choice made without hesitation. And while they waited, Petra climbed into the chair across from Wubin, folded her hands on the table, and looked at him with an expression he was beginning to recognize as her working face. "Do you keep promises?" she asked. "I try to. I don't always succeed." She considered this. "That's okay. You have to try, though. Trying is the important part." She paused. "Do you know how to apologize properly?" "What does properly mean?" "It means you say what you did wrong. Not just sorry. Sorry doesn't tell anyone anything." "Then yes," he said. "I'm learning." She nodded slowly, filing this away. The food arrived, and still she was not done. She opened a container of rice with the focused efficiency of someone who had been feeding herself since she was 4, spooned a portion onto her plate, and looked back up at him. "Do you like dogs?" Aaliyah, who had been quietly arranging containers on the table, went very still. "I've never had one," Wubin said. "I think I'd like them." "I want a dog," Petra said. "A medium one. Not too big and not too small. Mama says we can't yet because of the apartment, but I'm working on it." She said this with the patient confidence of someone who regarded the word yet as a binding, contractual commitment. She ate for a while. Wubin ate. Aaliyah sat between them and said little, watching her daughter conduct what was transparently an interview with the focused composure of a hiring committee. Outside the window, the evening was settling, the light going amber and slow over the rooftops. Petra chewed thoughtfully, set down her fork. One wiped her mouth with the corner of a napkin. "You can come back," she said, with the gravity of someone delivering a considered ruling. Then, "But not every day. Mama needs quiet time." Wubin pressed his lips together. He looked at the table for a moment, and then, because he could not help it, he looked at Aaliyah. She was already looking at him. Something in his face had clearly done something unexpected, because she let out a short, helpless breath of laughter. Real laughter, unguarded. The kind that arrives before you can decide whether to allow it. It lasted only a moment, but the room was warmer afterward, unmistakably, in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. Petra picked her fork back up, satisfied. Dinner continued. A month does not announce itself. It arrives in small increments. A Tuesday, then another, then the particular rhythm of a life that has begun, without formal agreement, to include someone new. A Wubin learned Aaliyah the way you learn something worth knowing, slowly and by paying attention. He learned that she woke early and needed the first half hour alone with her coffee, and that respecting this was more important than any gesture he could have made. He learned that she deflected compliments not out of false modesty, but out of a lifelong habit of not trusting them. And so he stopped offering them and started instead simply naming what he observed, plainly and without decoration. He learned that she laughed most when she wasn't expecting to, and that making her laugh unexpectedly was one of the better things he had done with his time. He learned Petra's Tuesday spelling tests and her Thursday library returns, and her absolute refusal to accept that any color held a candle to orange. He bought her an orange notebook. She received it with the solemn appreciation of someone who recognized being truly seen. He made mistakes. When he sent Aaliyah flowers that cost more than her weekly grocery run, and watched her face close in the way it did when something felt too much like charity, he named it the next time he saw her. "I got that wrong. I understand why." And she looked at him with something shifting in her expression, as though she had prepared for justification and received accountability instead, and didn't quite know what to do with the difference. He paid attention to that too. Jun Seo said nothing for 3 weeks. Then one morning, reviewing his schedule, she said without looking up, "Is this a phase?" Wubin thought about it honestly, which was the only way the question deserved to be answered. "No," he said. Jun Seo nodded once. "Good," she said, and turned the page. The evening it changed, or rather the evening he understood clearly what was changing, arrived without announcement, the way the important ones do. They had eaten together, the 3 of them. And afterward, Petra had migrated to the couch with a book and been asleep inside 20 minutes, her cheek pressed against the armrest, her orange notebook on the cushion beside her. Aaliyah came to collect her, and Wubin stood as though he were leaving, and then did not leave, and neither of them commented on this. He simply stayed while she carried Petra to bed and tucked her in and came back down the hallway. And when she reached the kitchen, he had already set the kettle on. She looked at him for a moment. She sat down. He poured the tea. They sat at the kitchen table and talked about nothing important. Petra's spelling test, a film she had meant to see, the particular way the streetlight came through the window at this hour. It was ordinary. It was, he was quite certain, everything. His mother had not built a life by avoiding difficult conversations, and so she did not avoid this one. She simply waited until she was ready to have it properly, and then she called him and told him to come for tea on Saturday, and the particular tone she used let him know that tea was not really the point. He arrived on time. She had set the table the way she always did for serious conversations. The good cups, the careful arrangement that meant she had been thinking about this for longer than she intended to let on. She poured. She did not begin. She was making him understand, in the way she had always communicated the things that mattered, was that he would be the one to speak first. He told her everything, not to seek her permission. He was 33 years old and had already made the decision, and they both knew it. He told her because she had given him enough to deserve the truth, and because she was his mother, and because somewhere in the last 6 months he had learned, partly from watching Aaliyah, that honesty offered freely was not the same as honesty extracted. He told her about Aaliyah, what she was, searched what she had built, how she carried herself through a life that asked a great deal of her and received it without complaint. He told her about the wedding, not sparing himself. He told her about Petra, who had taken a bus in a blue dress and said the truest thing in the room, and whom he had come to love with a straightforwardness that still surprised him. His mother listened. She had opinions. He had expected this, had prepared himself for it. And he let her voice each one without interruption or defense. Some of them were practical. Some of them were about what people would say. Some of them revealed fears he recognized because he had spent years letting them make his decisions for him. He let her finish. Then he said, "She is the person I want. Petra is part of that." The room was quiet. His mother looked at her tea. She was not a woman who spoke before she was ready, and so he waited, the way Aaliyah had once waited for him, and the way Petra had waited at the altar, with the patience of someone who has already said the necessary thing and understands that the rest belongs to someone else. "Is she good?" his mother asked finally. He thought about Aaliyah on the bathroom floor and at the kitchen table, and in every ordinary moment in between, where she had chosen honesty over performance and precision over ease. "She is the best person I know," he said. His mother looked at her tea for a long time. "Won't you bring them for dinner?" she said. It was not a welcome. It was not absolution. It was something more durable. A door held open an inch, with the possibility of wider. He recognized it because he had been given one himself. He said, "Okay." He drove home in the quiet and called Aaliyah and told her simply that there was something they should talk about. She said okay in the careful way she said things when she was already preparing herself. And he said, because he had learned by now that reassurance delivered plainly was not the same as a compliment she could deflect. "It's a beginning, a real one." A pause, then, "Okay," she said again, differently. The room was small enough that you could see everyone's faces. This was, Wubin had come to understand, the point. He had spent enough time in rooms built to impress that he had learned to recognize the difference between a gathering designed to be witnessed and one designed to be felt. This one was the latter. Close family, the people who had shown up without being asked during the months when showing up required something real, and Jun Seo, who stood near the end of the second row in a charcoal dress and cried once, quietly and completely, and then composed herself with such finality that it was almost possible to believe it hadn't happened. Petra went first. She had been briefed on the role of flower girl with the seriousness she brought to all consequential matters, and she had asked two clarifying questions. How wide should the intervals be, and was there a correct speed, before declaring herself ready. She walked the aisle now with the focused deliberation of a person executing a plan. There were scattering petals in measurements that were, as far as anyone could tell, genuinely even. She did not smile for the room. She was working. Aaliyah came in behind her, and the room rose, and Wu Bin watched her walk toward him and felt, as he had been feeling for months in the accumulated weight of ordinary evenings, that this was the only place he had ever been that deserved the word right. The vows were short. They had written them at the kitchen table on a Tuesday, one with Petra asleep in the next room and the tea going cold, and they had agreed without discussing it that the vows would say only what was true. Aaliyah spoke first. "You came back," she said. "I didn't ask you to. That matters more than you know." He looked at her for a moment before he spoke. "I stood at an altar and knew I was in the wrong place." His voice was even. "You are the right place. You and Petra both." At the sound of her name, Petra looked up from her empty petal basket. She studied Wubin's face. then Aaliyah's. She conducted the same brief, careful assessment she applied to all important decisions, and then she gave a single, authoritative nod. Approved. The room exhaled into something that was not quite laughter and not quite tears, and was perhaps the sound of people recognizing something true. Afterward, in the small garden where they had set up chairs and a table of food, one of Aaliyah's cousins crouched down to Petra's level and asked, and with genuine curiosity, whether she had known, when she put on the blue dress and took the bus, that it would all work out this way. Petra thought about it with appropriate seriousness. She still had her basket. She had been wondering if she could keep it. I knew someone had to say something, she said, and Mama doesn't like to make a fuss. She considered the basket. She decided she would keep it.